My name is Jenna Marsh. I'm 34 years old. And on a Sunday afternoon that started out like any other family lunch, my mother-in-law Carol set down a casserole dish in the middle of her dining table, folded her hands like she was about to say grace, and instead said, "The family voted. We've decided the car should go to Brooke, since she actually has kids to drive around." I want you to picture the exact moment that sentence landed, because I've replayed it more times than I can count since. The table was set the way Carol always sets it, cloth napkins folded into triangles, the good silverware that only comes out for Sunday lunches, a pitcher of iced tea sweating slightly in the afternoon light coming through her kitchen window. I was holding my coffee mug in both hands, the steam still curling up off the top of it, and for a second I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. The way you mishear something so far outside what you expected that your brain simply refuses to process it correctly the first time. Sam's hand, resting on the table next to mine, had gone completely still, the specific stillness of someone who's just realized a conversation is about to go somewhere he didn't fully prepare for either. The car she was talking about was mine. Not mine as in the one I happened to be driving that year. Mine as in the graduation gift my own father gave me, the last real gift he ever gave me before he passed. A car worth about $70,000 that I have kept in careful condition for 6 years specifically, because of who gave it to me and why. I set my mug down slowly on the table, the way you set something down when you need a few extra seconds to make sure your voice comes out steady instead of shaking. And I said, "That's interesting. Because the car isn't titled in a way you can vote on." The table went quiet in that particular way tables go quiet, when everyone in the room already halfway knows something uncomfortable is about to happen, and nobody wants to be the one who says the wrong thing first. Frank, Sam's father, reached for the pitcher of iced tea like refilling his glass might make the moment pass faster. It didn't. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, the channel where ordinary people meet the moment that changes everything, and choose facts over noise, every single time. If you've ever had someone try to redistribute something that was never theirs to redistribute in the first place, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me you're here, and stay with me until the very end, because what my mother-in-law actually knew, what she didn't know, and what came out over the following weeks, turned into something far bigger than a disagreement over a car. Let me back up, because you need to understand the 6 years before that Sunday to understand exactly what that sentence really was. I married my husband Sam 8 years ago, and from almost the very beginning, I understood, in the quiet, gradual way you understand things you can't quite name yet, that his mother Carol treated my place in the family as something closer to a probationary membership than a permanent one. Not overtly hostile, not the kind of mother-in-law who says cruel things to your face at holidays. Just a specific, persistent pattern of small exclusions, decisions made about shared family matters that somehow always seemed to happen in rooms I wasn't in, conversations that got summarized to me afterward rather than had with me directly. I remember, early in our marriage, a Thanksgiving where Carol had already assigned which side dishes everyone was bringing before I'd even been asked what I wanted to contribute, and when I mentioned I'd been hoping to make my own grandmother's stuffing recipe, she said, lightly, "Oh, we already have stuffing covered, but maybe next year." A next year that never actually arrived in 6 subsequent Thanksgivings. Small moments like that, stacked up over years, taught me something about how decisions moved through this family long before that Sunday with the car ever happened. I told myself, for years, that this was simply how large families with long histories worked, that I was the newer addition, and it would take time to be fully absorbed into the way things were decided. 6 years in, I'd started to understand that wasn't actually what was happening. It wasn't about time. It was about a particular structure Carol had built and clearly intended to maintain. My father passed 6 years ago, the same year Sam and I got married, actually, just 4 months before the wedding, which meant he never got to walk me down the aisle, something I've made my peace with slowly and imperfectly over the years since, though there are still moments, at other people's weddings mostly, where it catches me off guard all over again. The car was the last significant thing he gave me, purchased the spring before he died as a graduation gift for finishing my master's degree, a gift he was, according to everyone who knew him, disproportionately proud to give, because he'd spent years telling anyone who'd listen that his daughter was going to drive something nice one day if it killed him to make sure of it. I remember the day he handed me the keys, in the driveway of the house I grew up in, wrapped in a ridiculous oversized bow he'd clearly bought specifically for the occasion, grinning in a way I hadn't seen from him in years, already slower by then from the illness we didn't yet know would take him within the year. I've kept that car in careful condition for 6 years, not because I'm precious about material things generally, but because it's one of the only physical objects I have left that still smells faintly, if you catch it at the right angle on a warm day, like the cologne he used to wear. Sam's sister Brooke is 2 years older than him, married with 2 young kids, and drives an aging minivan that's genuinely been giving her trouble for the better part of a year, something the whole family has known about and occasionally commented on at gatherings. I don't say this to diminish her actual need. Brooke's situation is real, and I felt for her more than once watching her wrestle 2 car seats in and out of a vehicle that stalls at stoplights. What I didn't know, sitting at that table with my coffee going cold, was exactly how that real, sympathetic need had been quietly weaponized into a justification for something that was never actually anyone's to decide except mine. The family meeting Carol referenced that Sunday, the one where she claimed the family had voted, turned out, once I started asking careful questions over the following days, to have never actually included me at all. It had been a phone call, 4 people total: Carol, her husband Frank, Sam's uncle Roy, and Brooke herself, held on an evening 2 weeks earlier when I happened to be traveling for a work conference in another state. Sam hadn't even been on that call. 4 people had discussed, at length apparently, what should happen to a car that belonged to a 5th person, who was never invited into the conversation, and had then presented the outcome to me as an established family consensus rather than what it actually was, which was a decision made entirely without me, about me. What none of them knew, and what I only fully understood myself once I went back through some old paperwork my father's estate attorney had helped me organize years earlier, was that the car wasn't simply mine in the straightforward way everyone assumed. My father hadn't just handed me the keys and a title. He'd purchased the vehicle through a small family trust he'd set up in the last 2 years of his life, specific language built in, apparently, at his own insistence, that the vehicle, or its replacement value if it were ever sold or transferred, would revert to trust oversight if it left the hands of his direct descendants. I hadn't thought about that clause in years, honestly, because it had never once been relevant to anything in my life until that Sunday afternoon. It became extremely relevant very quickly. I found out something else in that same stretch of days that reframed how I understood Brooke's role in all of this. Brooke hadn't asked for the car. She'd been told it was already hers. She'd apparently mentioned it to her own friends at a birthday party the weekend before, told them she was finally getting Jenna's old car, and had already started browsing online for booster seats in colors that would match it. When I learned this, sitting in my kitchen scrolling through a screenshot Sam's cousin had sent me almost apologetically, I felt something shift in how angry I actually was, and at whom. Brooke wasn't scheming behind my back. She'd been handed a version of reality, by her own mother that made this sound settled, generous, already decided, and she had no more reason to question it than I would have had, if our positions were reversed. I brought all of this to Sam that same week, and what he told me, reluctantly, sitting on the edge of our bed with his hands laced together like he was bracing for something, was that this wasn't actually the first time his mother had run this exact play. I should have told you about the dresser thing back when we first started dating, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I honestly forgot about it until this happened, which probably says something about how normal it felt at the time. Years earlier, before Sam and I were even married, Carol had tried something almost identical with a piece of furniture that had belonged to Sam's late grandmother, an antique dresser everyone in the family had some sentimental attachment to. Carol had announced, at a family gathering, that everyone agreed the dresser should go to a specific cousin, framing it as settled consensus, until that same cousin, uncomfortable with the framing, quietly pushed back and revealed she'd never actually been asked anything at all. The dresser situation had fizzled out quietly at the time, absorbed into family history, as an awkward blip nobody discussed again. Hearing about it now, with fresh eyes, I understood it wasn't a blip. It was a pattern, tested once before, that had simply been waiting for its next opportunity. "Why didn't you say something the second she brought up the car?" I asked him, and I watched him actually think about the question instead of rushing to defend himself, which I appreciated more than I expected to in the moment. "I did," he said. "Weeks ago. I told her it wasn't hers to give, and she just sort of nodded and changed the subject. I thought that meant she'd dropped it." What Sam told me next explained something I hadn't understood about timing, about why now, specifically, with this specific car. His younger brother Marcus let it slip, almost by accident, during a phone call about something else entirely, that Brooke and her husband had been quietly having serious problems, to the point that divorce had come up more than once in private conversations within the family that I'd never been included in. Marcus, to his credit, sounded uncomfortable even telling me, lowering his voice like he was worried someone might overhear him through the phone. "I probably shouldn't have said anything," he told me afterward, "but I figured you deserved to know why this was happening now instead of 2 years ago, or 2 years from now." Carol, it seemed, had decided that giving Brooke something significant, something that would feel like the family rallying around her during a hard private stretch, was a way of managing her daughter's crisis without actually addressing the crisis itself. I want to be fair to Carol here, as frustrating as that is for me to say. I don't think she woke up one morning deciding to be cruel to me specifically. I think she saw a daughter in quiet pain and reached for the nearest available comfort she could offer, and the fact that the nearest available comfort happened to belong to someone else entirely didn't fully register to her as a problem, because in her mind, family resources had always functioned as somewhat communal, at least when it suited the specific direction she wanted things to move in. There was one more detail from that same conversation with Sam that genuinely surprised me, more than almost anything else in this whole situation. He confirmed, again, that he'd pushed back on the idea privately, weeks before that Sunday lunch, when Carol first mentioned wanting to do something for Brooke involving my car, and that she'd proceeded with the family meeting and the announcement anyway, apparently deciding that presenting it as an already settled group decision would be harder for either of us to argue with than raising it as an open request. Sam hadn't warned me beforehand because, in his words, he genuinely thought she'd dropped it after he objected. Learning that his objection had simply been absorbed and worked around, rather than respected, was its own small, quiet gut punch, on top of everything else. The days after that Sunday lunch got stranger, not calmer. Carol posted in the family group chat, a sprawling thread that includes cousins, aunts, in-laws, nearly 20 people total, thanking everyone who voted for supporting Brooke during a hard time, a message phrased in exactly the kind of warm, communal language that makes anyone reading it afterward assume a broad, caring consensus existed, rather than a single phone call among 4 specific people 2 weeks earlier. I watched replies come in underneath it, well-meaning relatives sending heart emojis and comments about how lovely it was that the family looked out for each other, each one adding another quiet layer of manufactured legitimacy to something that had never actually been agreed to by anyone with the actual authority to agree to it. I decided, around this point, to go back to the actual trust paperwork myself instead of relying on memory, and found something I hadn't fully absorbed the first time I'd read through it years earlier. The trust required me to notify a named trustee before making any major decision regarding trust-connected property, and that trustee wasn't any member of Sam's family, or even mine. It was my father's old business partner, a quiet, precise man named Walter Hutchins, who I'd met maybe 4 or 5 times over the years at holiday gatherings when I was younger. I want to be honest that this discovery cut both ways for me. It meant Carol's family, quite simply, had no legal standing whatsoever to redistribute the car. It also meant I couldn't simply declare the matter closed on my own authority either, without at least formally notifying Walter, which felt, at the time, like an inconvenient complication rather than the gift it eventually turned out to be. I called Walter that same week, more out of procedural obligation than any real expectation that the conversation would change much. He picked up on the second ring, his voice exactly as I remembered it from those handful of holiday gatherings years ago, measured and unhurried in a way that felt oddly reassuring given how chaotic everything else had become. I explained the situation as plainly as I could, the Sunday lunch, the announced vote, the trust language I'd rediscovered. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line before saying, "I was wondering when something like this might come up. Your father thought it might, eventually." What he told me next changed everything about how I understood my father's final years. He mentioned, almost in passing, that my father had specifically discussed with him, more than once before he died, wanting the car's value protected specifically for me, because, in my father's own words apparently, he didn't trust how that family treated her, even back then. He never said that to me directly, I told Walter, my voice catching slightly. He wouldn't have, Walter said. He wasn't the type to say something like that out loud if he thought it might cause trouble in your marriage. He just made sure the paperwork would say it for him, eventually, if it ever needed to. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot listening to Walter say this, completely still, because it meant my father had seen this exact dynamic clearly, years before that Sunday lunch ever happened, before I'd even fully named it to myself. He'd built a legal safeguard around a pattern he recognized from the outside, long before I'd stopped explaining it away, as simply how big families work. Carol, it turned out, wasn't willing to let the matter rest once she learned a trustee was actually involved. She contacted Walter directly herself, a fact I only learned afterward when Walter mentioned it to me with the same dry, understated tone he seemed to bring to everything. "Your mother-in-law called my office last week," he told me, and I could hear something close to amusement in his voice, the specific amusement of a man who has spent decades handling far more complicated family disputes than this one. She'd apparently attempted to argue that family consensus should reasonably override whatever formal paperwork existed, framing herself, according to Walter's account, as simply trying to do right by everyone involved. I told her the trust doesn't have a provision for family consensus, Walter said. I told her it has a provision for your father's wishes, clearly documented, and that those wishes named you, specifically, and nobody else. He declined her, politely, professionally, without a trace of emotion attached to it, the exact kind of institutional, unbothered rejection that carries far more weight than anything I could have said to Carol myself in the heat of a family argument. There's something about a stranger with no emotional stake in the outcome calmly saying no that lands differently than the same no coming from the person everyone already assumes is simply being difficult. Brooke found out, around the same time, exactly how the situation had actually unfolded, and her reaction surprised me in the best possible way. She wasn't angry with me. She was furious with her own mother. She called me directly, something we'd never really done one-on-one before in 8 years of being sisters-in-law, and I remember being genuinely surprised to see her name on my phone screen at all. "I need to tell you I had no idea," she said, before I'd even fully said hello. Her voice was tight, the specific tightness of someone who's been crying recently and is trying not to start again. She told me she felt sick learning she'd been telling her friends about a car that was never actually available to give her in the first place, that she felt used, in a way, as a prop in whatever Carol had actually been trying to accomplish. "I would never have wanted it like this," she said, her voice tight in a way that made clear she meant it. "I didn't even know there was a vote. I thought Mom had already talked to you." I believed her completely. It wasn't hard to. We talked for almost an hour that night, longer than we'd probably talked one-on-one in the entire 8 years we'd known each other, and somewhere in that conversation, she told me, quietly, some of what had actually been happening in her marriage, the thing Marcus had alluded to weeks earlier. I didn't push for details, she wasn't ready to share. I just listened, the way I would have wanted someone to listen to me, and by the end of the call, something between us had genuinely shifted, not because of the car at all, but in spite of everything that had happened around it. The next real turning point came at a subsequent family dinner, one I almost didn't attend, honestly, given how the last one had gone. The table was smaller that time, just Carol, Frank, Sam, and me, with Brooke arriving a little late, and I could feel the tension the moment I walked in, the specific tension of people who've all been talking about the same thing separately without ever quite saying it together in the same room. Carol tried, once more, to reframe the entire situation, saying something about how the family just wanted to help Brooke, and she didn't understand why everyone was making it so complicated. Sam, sitting beside me, did something I'd genuinely never seen him do before in 8 years of marriage. He set down his fork, looked directly at his mother, and said, calmly but firmly, "Mom, it was never the family's decision to make. I told you that weeks ago, and I should have said it again the second you brought it up at lunch instead of assuming you'd already dropped it." Carol's face did something complicated, surprise and defensiveness moving across it almost simultaneously. "I was only trying to help your sister," she said. "I know," Sam said, "and I understand why. But it wasn't yours to give, and it wasn't mine either, and pretending otherwise in front of the whole family wasn't fair to Jenna or to Brooke." The table went quiet again, the same specific quiet from that first Sunday, except this time, it wasn't me who'd broken it, and it wasn't me who had to be the one to hold that silence alone. Frank, who'd said almost nothing through this entire ordeal, finally spoke up, quietly, saying he thought Sam had a point, which seemed to surprise Carol more than anything Sam himself had said. Carol didn't apologize outright that night. But something in the room had shifted, the same way it had with Brooke on the phone, a small crack in a dynamic that had felt, for years, completely immovable. Carol tried one more time after that dinner, posting again in the group chat, implying, in careful, wounded language, that I was choosing money over family, a framing clearly designed to shift the emotional narrative back onto me as the difficult one. I remember reading that message standing in my kitchen, feeling the old familiar flare of frustration, the instinct to type out a long, detailed rebuttal explaining everything, the trust, the phone call I was never part of, all of it. I didn't send anything. I didn't need to, as it turned out. This time, Brooke replied publicly, in the same thread, correcting the record herself, stating plainly that she'd never asked for the car, hadn't known about any vote in advance, and was upset about how the whole situation had been handled from the beginning. Her message was calm, factual, and unmistakably clear, the kind of correction that doesn't need to raise its voice to land hard. Watching that message appear in a group chat, with nearly 20 relatives reading along was its own quiet, satisfying kind of consequence, the manufactured consensus Carol had built collapsing under its own paper trail, in the exact forum she'd used to construct it in the first place. Nobody else in the thread said anything after that. The silence itself felt like its own kind of answer. I want to tell you honestly how this actually ended, because I think the satisfying version and the true version happen to be the same one here, which doesn't always happen. I didn't simply keep the car and walk away feeling vindicated, though I understand why that would have felt reasonable. Once things had settled, genuinely settled, not just gone quiet out of exhaustion, I worked with Walter to set up a modest, separate fund using a portion of money from elsewhere in my father's estate, money that had nothing to do with the car itself, specifically to help Brooke get something reliable of her own, on her own terms, without any family theater or strings attached to it. No group chat announcement. No framing it as a family decision. Just a private conversation between me and Brooke, one sister-in-law to another, telling her I wanted to help, because I actually cared about her situation, not because anyone had voted on anything. I drove to her house myself to tell her, sitting in her kitchen, which felt more appropriate somehow than doing it over the phone again. She cried before I'd even finished the sentence, and so, a little, did I, both of us laughing at ourselves for crying over a conversation about a car, of all things, when it had clearly stopped being about the car a long time before that afternoon. She has a reliable car now, one she picked out herself, one nobody gets to claim credit for deciding on her behalf, a small, practical sedan, she says handles better in the rain than her old minivan ever did. Carol doesn't talk about the car anymore, in the group chat, or anywhere else, and the dynamic between us hasn't magically transformed into warmth, but it has shifted into something more honest, the quieter mutual understanding that decisions about my life, and about what was actually mine, aren't hers to make unilaterally and then present to me as already settled. We still have Sunday lunches. The casserole dishes still come out the same way they always have. But Sam speaks up now, in small ways, when something starts drifting back toward the old pattern, and I've noticed Carol catching herself, sometimes mid-sentence, in a way she never used to before any of this happened. I still think about that Sunday sometimes, the casserole dish, the steam off my coffee mug, the specific sentence about a family vote I was never part of. I don't think about it with anger anymore, most days. I think about it as the moment I finally understood a pattern that had been quietly running in the background of my marriage for 6 years, and the moment my father's quiet, careful foresight, built years before he died, turned out to matter more than I ever expected it to. That's my story. One casserole dish, one invented vote, and one father's quiet legal safeguard that ended up protecting more than just a car. If this reminded you that the people around you don't always have the authority they act like they have over your life, take that as your sign today. Check your own paperwork. Ask who actually gets a say in the decisions being made about you. And if this reminded you of someone in your own life, send it to them tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Hit subscribe, so the next story finds you when it's ready. And I'll see you in the next one.